can't do this!
Well, this is your father's last will. There's nothing I can do about it.
I can't take this. You and Angela has manipulated this will. No, it's not acceptable by me. I will contest this will in the court.
You're free to go to court.
He died alone in a mansion that could have held 40 guests, and when his children finally came back, it wasn't for his funeral, it was for his money. But the will he left behind broke every single one of their hearts, and by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why. Welcome back to the channel, where we bring you true-to-life stories about family, betrayal, and the price people pay when greed takes over love. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this one remind us what really matters before it's too late. Now sit back, because this is the story of Frank Coleman, a man who built an empire with his bare hands, and the family that nearly destroyed him before destiny had the final word. Frank Coleman was born in 1951 in a small town outside Springfield, Missouri, to a family that had nothing but pride and hard work. His father drove a delivery truck for a lumber company, and his mother cleaned houses on the wealthy side of town, the side where Frank used to stand outside iron gates as a boy and stare at homes he swore he would one day own. He never forgot that feeling. He carried it with him through high school, through 2 years of community college he paid for by working nights at a gas station, and through his 20s, when he took every last dollar he had saved and invested it into a small hardware supply business in St. Louis. By the time he was 35, that small supply business had grown into a regional construction materials empire. By 50, Frank Coleman's name was attached to shopping centers, office parks, and residential developments across 3 states. He was, by every account, a self-made man. But wealth, as Frank would learn, does not protect a man from loneliness, and it certainly does not protect him from the people closest to him. Frank married his first wife, Diane, when he was 26 years old. Back then, Diane was warm, ambitious, and just as hungry for a better life as he was. They built the business together in the early years. Diane handled the books. Frank handled the deals. Together they raised 2 children, a son named Derek and a daughter named Vanessa, in a beautiful colonial home in Ladue, one of St. Louis's most prestigious neighborhoods. For a long time, it looked like the Coleman family had everything anyone could ever want. But money changes people, and slowly, over the years, it changed Diane. As Frank's success grew, so did Diane's coldness. She stopped asking about his day. She stopped attending his business dinners. She began spending more time with her country club friends than with her own husband. Frank would come home late from closing another deal, only to find the house dark, Diane already asleep, no dinner waiting, no conversation to be had. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow erosion, the kind that happens over 15, 20 years, until one day a man wakes up and realizes he is sleeping next to a stranger. Frank tried counseling. He tried vacations. He tried buying Diane gifts, taking her on trips to Napa Valley and the Amalfi Coast, hoping something would reignite what they once had. Nothing worked. Diane had grown comfortable in her resentment, and comfort, as it turns out, is far more powerful than love once it takes root. By the time Derek was 25 and Vanessa was 22, both fully grown and living their own lives funded generously by their father, Frank and Diane's marriage existed only on paper. They lived under the same roof, but led entirely separate lives. Frank began spending more time at his office in downtown St. Louis, sometimes sleeping there on the leather couch, rather than going home to a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. It was during this lonely chapter of his life that Frank met Angela Turner. Angela worked as an interior designer, and Frank had hired her firm to renovate one of his newest commercial properties in downtown Nashville, Tennessee. She was 38 years old at the time, sharp, warm, and completely unimpressed by Frank's wealth, which, ironically, was exactly what drew him to her. Angela didn't care about his properties or his bank accounts. She asked him about his childhood in Springfield. She asked him if he was happy. Nobody had asked Frank that question in over a decade. Their friendship grew slowly and respectfully over the course of a year. Frank was careful. He didn't want to be the cliché of a wealthy older man chasing a younger woman. But what grew between him and Angela wasn't about age or status. It was about connection. the kind Frank hadn't felt with another human being since the earliest years of his marriage to Diane. Eventually, Frank made the decision to file for divorce. He sat Diane down in the study of their Ladue home and told her, as gently as he could, that their marriage had been over for years, in every way that mattered, and that he wanted to finally be honest with both of them. Diane didn't cry. She didn't fight for the marriage. She simply asked, in a voice as cold as the day she'd stopped loving him, how much she would be getting in the settlement. The divorce was finalized quietly. Diane received a generous settlement, more than enough to maintain the lifestyle she had grown accustomed to, along with the Ladue home itself, which Frank signed over to her without a single objection. He wanted no more conflict than necessary. He simply wanted peace. 2 years later, Frank married Angela in a small private ceremony at a vineyard outside Charlottesville, Virginia. Only a handful of close friends attended. Neither Derek nor Vanessa came. This was the beginning of the fracture that would define the rest of Frank Coleman's life. Derek, now 27 and working, somewhat half-heartedly, in a junior role at his father's company, was furious about the marriage. In his mind, Angela was an opportunist, a woman who had seen a lonely, wealthy man and swooped in to take what rightfully belonged to him and Vanessa. He conveniently ignored the fact that his mother had spent 2 decades emotionally abandoning his father. He conveniently ignored the fact that Angela had never once asked Frank for money, property, or position, not before the marriage and not after. Vanessa, 24 and living off a generous monthly allowance her father had set up for her since college, echoed her brother's anger, though with less venom and more performative hurt. She told friends that her father had replaced her mother, that he had betrayed the family, and that Angela was nothing more than a gold digger who deserved none of the Coleman legacy. The truth, which neither of them wanted to admit, was far less dramatic. Frank had simply found happiness again after years of loneliness, and his children resented him for it, not because Angela had done anything wrong, but because her presence forced them to confront the truth about their mother's failures and about their own entitlement. A year after the wedding, Angela gave birth to a son. They named him Caleb. Caleb Coleman's arrival should have been a joyful moment for the family. Instead, it deepened the divide. Derek and Vanessa saw Caleb not as a baby brother, but as a threat, a new heir who would dilute their claim to their father's fortune. They stopped visiting the house in Nashville where Frank and Angela had settled. They stopped answering Frank's calls except when they needed something, usually money. Frank, to his credit, never stopped trying to bridge the gap. He invited Derek and Vanessa to every holiday. He sent them birthday gifts, invited them to company events, tried repeatedly to include them in Caleb's life. But every gesture was met with cold indifference or outright hostility. Things came to a head 3 years after Caleb was born, when Frank, now 68 years old and beginning to think seriously about his legacy, called a family meeting at his Nashville estate. He wanted to discuss the future of the company and the eventual distribution of his assets. Derek and Vanessa arrived expecting a conversation about their inheritance. What they got instead was a father trying, one last time, to hold his family together. Frank explained that he intended to divide his estate fairly among all 3 of his children, Derek, Vanessa, and Caleb, once he passed, along with provisions to ensure Angela was cared for. He asked only one thing in return, that Derek and Vanessa treat Angela and Caleb with respect, that they stop the years of coldness and resentment, and that they start acting like a family again. Derek, instead of accepting this olive branch, exploded. He accused his father of favoring the new family over the real family. He demanded to know exactly how much of the estate would go to Caleb, as if his 3-year-old half-brother were a business competitor rather than a child. Vanessa, following her brother's lead, demanded that her father sign over a portion of his real estate holdings immediately, rather than waiting for some eventual inheritance. She said she didn't trust that Angela wouldn't manipulate their father into cutting them out entirely. Frank, stunned and hurt by the audacity of the demand, refused. He told his children that everything would be handled fairly through his will, as any responsible parent would do, and that demanding assets while he was still alive and in good health was not only inappropriate, but deeply disrespectful. That refusal was the final straw for Derek and Vanessa. 2 months later, Frank discovered that a beachfront property he owned in Hilton Head, South Carolina, a property he had purchased decades earlier and had personally promised to leave to his children as a shared vacation home, had been quietly sold. Derek, it turned out, still had power of attorney documents from years earlier that Frank had never formally revoked, paperwork drawn up back when Frank was recovering from a minor heart procedure and wanted his son to be able to handle emergency matters. Derek had used those old, technically still valid documents to arrange the sale without his father's knowledge or consent, splitting the proceeds with Vanessa. When Frank confronted them, there was no remorse, no apology. Derek told his father flatly that it was his inheritance anyway, and that he had simply taken it early. Vanessa didn't even bother to respond to her father's calls. Within weeks, both Derek and Vanessa had used their portion of the money to relocate out of Missouri entirely, settling 400 miles away in Charlotte, North Carolina, cutting off nearly all contact with their father, Angela, and young Caleb. Frank Coleman was devastated. Not by the money. The property, while valuable, was a small fraction of his overall net worth. What devastated him was the realization that his own children, the ones he had raised, provided for, and loved unconditionally, saw him as nothing more than a financial resource to be extracted from. He had built an empire so that his family would never know the hardship he had known growing up, outside those iron gates in Springfield, and in return, his oldest children had betrayed his trust in the most calculated way possible. Angela, for her part, never once said, "I told you so." She held Frank as he cried in their kitchen the night he found out about the sale, the same kitchen where Caleb, now 4 years old, sat drawing pictures at the table, blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around him. Angela told Frank that whatever he decided to do about his will was his decision alone, that she had never married him for his money, and never wanted him to feel pressured to protect her and Caleb financially, out of guilt or anger toward his older children. But Frank had made up his mind. He met with his longtime estate attorney, a sharp, discreet lawyer named Gerald Simmons, who had handled Frank's affairs for over 20 years, and instructed him to draft a new will. Under the new will, the vast majority of Frank Coleman's estate, including his primary residence in Nashville, his remaining real estate holdings, his controlling shares in Coleman Construction Materials, and his substantial investment portfolio, would go to Angela and Caleb. Derek and Vanessa would each receive a token sum, just enough to demonstrate that they had not been forgotten entirely, but nowhere close to the fortune they had once expected, and certainly nothing resembling the equal three-way split Frank had originally proposed at that fateful family meeting. Frank did not tell Derek or Vanessa about the change. In fact, over the following years, communication between Frank and his two oldest children dwindled to almost nothing. A birthday card here, a brief phone call there. But the warmth was long gone, replaced by a painful, permanent distance. Frank continued to run his company, continued to raise Caleb alongside Angela, and continued to build a quiet, happy life in Nashville, even as the wound of his children's betrayal never fully healed. Frank Coleman turned 75 in the spring, and though he remained sharp and active, running board meetings and reviewing contracts well into his 70s, age eventually began to catch up with him. In the fall of that year, Frank suffered a serious stroke while at his office in downtown Nashville. He was rushed to Vanderbilt University Medical Center, where doctors worked for hours to stabilize him. He survived the initial stroke, but his health never fully recovered. Over the following 18 months, Frank's condition declined steadily. Angela, now in her early 50s, became his full-time caregiver, managing his medications, his doctor visits, and eventually, hospice care in the final months. Derek and Vanessa, informed of their father's declining health by Angela herself, out of decency rather than obligation, visited exactly twice during those 18 months. Both visits were brief, awkward, and largely silent. Neither Derek nor Vanessa asked their father for forgiveness. Neither offered to help with his care. They simply came, sat uncomfortably in his room for less than an hour, and left. Frank Coleman passed away peacefully, in his Nashville home, on a quiet Tuesday morning in early spring, with Angela by his side and 11-year-old Caleb asleep down the hall. He died the way he had lived the final chapter of his life, surrounded by the family he had chosen to build, not the family that had chosen to abandon him. The funeral was held at a church in Nashville and was attended by hundreds of people whose lives Frank had touched over the decades, former employees, business partners, charity organizations he had quietly supported for years without ever seeking recognition. Derek and Vanessa attended, dressed appropriately, playing the part of grieving children for the cameras and the community, though those who knew the family's history whispered among themselves about the years of estrangement. 2 weeks after the funeral, Gerald Simmons, Frank's longtime attorney, called a formal reading of the will. Derek and Vanessa arrived at the law office in downtown Nashville, dressed in expensive suits, clearly expecting to walk out as newly minted multimillionaires. Angela arrived quietly with Caleb, now a somber 11-year-old in an oversized blazer, sitting beside his mother. Gerald Simmons read through the document methodically. He explained that Frank Coleman's estate, valued at just under $400 million, would be distributed as follows. The Nashville estate, valued at $12 million, would go entirely to Angela Coleman. The controlling shares of Coleman Construction Materials, along with all associated commercial real estate holdings, valued at approximately $340 million, would be placed into a trust for Caleb Coleman, to be managed by Angela until Caleb turned 25. Angela would also receive a separate personal fund of $20 million, along with full ownership of several smaller residential properties across Tennessee and Missouri. Derek and Vanessa, meanwhile, would each receive a one-time payment of $500,000, along with a brief written letter from their father, to be read privately. The room fell silent. Derek's face went pale. Vanessa's hands began to shake. $500,000, a sum that would have seemed extraordinary to almost anyone else in America, felt like an insult compared to what they had spent years assuming was rightfully theirs. Derek stood up immediately, his voice rising as he accused Gerald Simmons of manipulation, accused Angela of coercing his father in his final vulnerable years, and threatened to contest the will in court. Vanessa, in tears, though whether from grief or greed no one could say for certain, echoed her brother's accusations, insisting that no father in his right mind would leave his biological children with so little. Gerald Simmons, calm and measured, reminded both of them, in front of everyone present, of the property sale 7 years earlier, the unauthorized use of old power of attorney documents, and the years of silence that followed. He reminded them of Frank's attempts at reconciliation, all of which had been rejected, and then he handed each of them the sealed letters their father had left specifically for this moment. Derek opened his letter first, his hands trembling with anger rather than sorrow. In it, Frank had written, in his own handwriting, that he had loved his son every single day of his life, that he had hoped for reconciliation until his final breath, but that he could not, in good conscience, reward years of betrayal and disrespect with the same inheritance he would have given had that betrayal never occurred. He explained that the $500,000 was not a punishment, but a final gift, an acknowledgement that despite everything, Derek was still his son, but the majority of his life's work, he wrote, would go to the family that had shown him unconditional love and loyalty during the years he needed it most. Vanessa's letter echoed similar sentiments, gentler in tone but no less final in its message. Frank wrote that he forgave her, that he hoped she would find peace, and that he hoped one day she would understand that respect and love cannot be demanded, only earned. Derek and Vanessa left the law office that day in stunned silence, the reality of their years of greed and disrespect finally settling in with a weight no amount of anger could lift. They had come back expecting to inherit a fortune. Instead, they inherited the consequences of the very choices they had made. Angela and Caleb, meanwhile, chose not to celebrate the reading of the will. There was no triumph in it for them, only grief for the man they had lost, and a quiet resolve to honor his legacy the way he would have wanted, with humility, generosity, and the same hard work that had built the Coleman name in the first place. Angela continued running the company's board with the same values Frank had instilled, expanding the family's charitable foundation, funding scholarships for underprivileged students in Missouri, the very kind of student Frank himself had once been, staring through iron gates, dreaming of a better life. As for Derek and Vanessa, reports years later suggested that both eventually rebuilt modest lives of their own, far removed from the wealth they had once assumed was guaranteed to them. Some say Derek eventually reached out to Caleb, now a young man managing his father's legacy, in an attempt at reconciliation. Whether that reconciliation ever truly healed the decades of damage, only the family itself will ever know. Now here is what this story really teaches us, and I want you to sit with this for a moment. Wealth was never the real inheritance Frank Coleman tried to leave his children. Respect, patience, and unconditional loyalty were the true inheritance, the one Derek and Vanessa forfeited long before their father ever changed a single word of his will. Money can be sold, spent, and squandered in an instant. But the relationships we build with the people who love us, those are the only things that truly compound in value over time. If there is one lesson to take from Frank Coleman's story, it is this. Never let entitlement replace gratitude in your relationship with the people who love you, especially your parents. Wealth, property, and inheritance mean nothing if they come at the cost of the relationships that built them in the first place. Treat the people in your life with the same respect and patience you would want in your own final days, because none of us know which day will be our last opportunity to make things right. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the importance of family, respect, and humility, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now, because we have dozens more true-to-life stories just like this one waiting for you. Drop a comment below and let me know what you would have done in Frank's position. And share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.
Please subscribe to my YouTube channel and support me. Thank you so much. I love you all. Bye!